The third chapter in your textbook introduces us to the biological aspects of psychology. This is one of my favorite chapters in the class for a number of reasons. Neuropsychology helps us to understand how we function. It gives us some very concrete explanations for otherwise abstract concepts like thought and emotions. Let's start by defining neuroscience as the broad study of the body's electrochemical circuitry. In other words, how the brain interacts with the environment. Before we get too far into neuroscience, let's establish the three basic rules. If you keep these three basic rules in mind, everything else will make sense. Rule number one, brain development follows a predictable path. We can see this development in terms of evolution of increasingly complex nervous systems, from simple mammals like mice and squirrels up to cats, dogs, various primates like macaques and chimpanzees, and then ultimately humans. We can also see this predictable path of development in an individual human. The human nervous system develops along the caudal-rostral axis, caudal meaning tail, rostral, nose, and from the center outwards, what we refer to as proximal distal development. So if you think about a very young infant, they can wiggle around, moving their torso and kicking their legs, but they don't have fine motor control to wiggle their fingers reliably. This is why even toddlers have trouble holding a glass of water without spilling it. Motor control develops from the center outwards. In the brain, functions that occur further back and down in the caudal-rostral axis develop very early on. Things like heart rate and breathing, then the startle response, then emotions, and only much later in life, complex reasoning and judgment, which occur at the very front of the brain. When we say development, what we're really referring to is the maturation of neurons. As you can see in this image, the neurons in an infant's brain do not have a lot of connections to other neurons. As we grow, neurons branch out and make connections. This increasing complexity of neural pathways progresses along that caudal-rostral axis. Rule number two, there can be no thought without neurotransmission. If there is neurotransmission, then there must be thought. Now, I'm using the term thought here very broadly. Any brain activity, whether it's input like hearing, seeing, tasting, processing like understanding and recognizing what you're hearing, seeing, and tasting, or output like talking, writing, gesturing, all of that, everything you do, everything you think, everything you remember is neurotransmission, meaning neurons sending electrochemical signals from one neuron to another. Rule number three, neurons that fire together, wire together. In other words, if I can get two sets of neurons to fire their electrical signals at the same time, those groups of neurons will actually reach out by growing dendrites and connect to each other. You have experienced this. At some point in your youth, a very nice person probably showed you this visual symbol and made the auditory sound A. And they did it over and over again until those neurons in your visual system linked up with those in your auditory system, and now this symbol makes the sound A. So this means that you are a nervous system, some of us more nervous than others. The function of your body is to support that nervous system. You'll hear the terms nerves and neurons used throughout this chapter. Let's just be clear about these two terms. Neurons are single cells that carry an electrical signal and communicate with each other chemically. Thus we say an electrochemical signal. Some neurons are tiny microscopic cells, such as those found in the brain. Others can be very large, relatively speaking, like those that carry signals from the bottom of your foot all the way up to your spinal cord. A nerve is a bundle of neurons wrapped together in a protective covering. A nerve is similar to a wire. When you cut into it, you would see multiple smaller wires that actually carry the signal. Some nerves carry signals to the brain. These are afferent nerves. Some nerves carry signals from the brain to the body. These are efferent nerves. I find the mnemonic afferent arrive and efferent exit helps to remember which is which. We can break the nervous system down into subsections. The brain and spinal cord make up the central nervous system, or CNS. Everything outside the brain and spinal cord is the peripheral nervous system, or PNS. The peripheral nervous system can be further divided into somatic system and the autonomic system. Soma is Greek for body, so the somatic system is the bodily system that is made up of sensory afferent nerves and motor efferent nerves. The autonomic system controls organs and glands. It is what causes the fight or flight reaction. When we're alarmed or psychologically aroused, the sympathetic system kicks in and does things like increasing heart rate, respiration, causing our pupils to dilate, skin to sweat. When the danger has passed, the parasympathetic system kicks in to calm us down and return to homeostasis. After the emergency, the paramedics arrive. Within the central nervous system, we have many types of cells. Glial cells provide structural support, nutrition, and assist in the transmitting of information from neuron to neuron. Neurons, of which we have about 100 billion, carry and process signals. Neurons throughout the brain do things like organizing incoming sensory information, exciting or inhibiting emotional responses, calculating outcomes, and issuing orders to other parts of the central or peripheral nervous system. Again, the rule is if you're doing something, neurons are firing and communicating. Before we get into the structure and function of a neuron, I want to clarify. We'll talk about how one neuron interacts with another neuron, but in reality, all processes involve large groups of neurons. It is rarely, if ever, a one-to-one process. So when it comes to structure, a neuron transmits an electrochemical signal in one direction, and always from dendrite to terminal button. So here we have the cell body, also called the soma, which contains the nucleus and organelles. Attached to the soma and feeding information into it are the dendrites. The dendrites receive a chemical signal from a preceding cell. That signal is then carried down the long axon towards the terminal branches. Neurons in the peripheral nervous system are myelinated. In other words, the axon is covered in a myelin sheath. The myelin sheath serves to protect the axon and also speed up the signal. The axon then divides into terminal branches. At the end of each branch is a terminal button, which transmits the signal to the dendrites of the next neuron or neurons. So let's stop there before we get into the actual function of neurons.